The bruise wasn't new, but it was the first time Silas Thorne saw it clearly. It bloomed like storm cloud shadow high on Martha's left arm, just below the rolled sleeve of her faded calico dress, stark against the pale skin dusted with flour as she kneaded dough. He froze in the kitchen doorway, the familiar creak of the floorboard loud in the sudden stillness. Her back was to him, shoulders hunched with a tension he'd mistaken for concentration. Now he saw the careful way she held herself, the slight tremor in her hands as she pushed into the yielding mound on the scarred pine table. He knew the shape of violence. He'd seen it before, etched on a face he loved, a memory that still scraped his insides raw. This wasn't a fall. This was a handprint. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, about something extra special saved just for you. Wind, the ever-present breath of the Wyoming high plains, sighed around the eaves of the Box T Ranch house. It swept across miles of undulating sagebrush flats, silver green and endless, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. To the west, the ragged teeth of the Wind River Range bit into a sky bleached pale blue by the relentless sun. Silas Thorne stood on the sagging porch, coffee mug cold in his calloused hand, his gaze fixed on that distant, indifferent horizon. Loneliness wasn't just a feeling out here. It was the landscape itself. Vast, empty, echoing. 3 years. 3 years since fever took Clara and little Ben, leaving him alone in this big, echoing house with only the ghosts of laughter and the accusing silence of the spare room. He'd buried them under the lone cottonwood by the creek, their graves marked by simple stones hauled from the ridge. After that, he'd buried himself too, deep in the rhythm of survival. Dawn till dusk, tending the small herd of cattle, mending fences that the wind and wandering bison constantly tested, coaxing life from the stubborn earth. The ranch hands drifted away, finding busier spreads or gold fields. Silas didn't replace them. The solitude suited the hollow ache inside him, a penance he wore like his worn leather chaps. Hiring Martha Croft had been an act of near desperation, born of exhaustion and the grim realization that cold biscuits and weak coffee were slowly eroding what little he had left. She'd arrived a month ago, stepping down from Jed Carter's supply wagon with a single worn carpet bag and eyes that held the same wary distance as a cornered jackrabbit. Thin, early 30s maybe, hair the color of sun-bleached straw pulled back in a severe knot. She spoke little, her voice low and husky, like stones grating together. Can cook, can clean, need work, don't need trouble. That was her interview. Silas, needing both food and the absence of another presence demanding conversation, had simply nodded. Porch room's yours. Pays fair. The house had transformed. Dust vanished. Windows gleamed. The smell of wood smoke from the big iron stove was now layered with the rich aromas of stews, baking bread, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Martha moved through the rooms like a shadow, efficient and silent. She anticipated his needs. A clean shirt laid out. His plate filled the moment he sat down, the lantern lit on the porch before dusk truly fell. But she was a fortress. Her gaze rarely met his, skittering away like water on hot iron. If he entered a room unexpectedly, she flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible recoil he'd initially chalked up to surprise. He'd hear the clatter of tin dishes cease abruptly when his boot heels sounded on the porch steps. He noticed things, the high-neck dresses, even in the sweltering kitchen heat. The way she favored her right side sometimes, a slight stiffness when she reached for a high shelf. A faint, fading yellow mark near her hairline one morning, expertly hidden by the way her hair was combed, revealed only when she bent over the washtub. He'd told himself it was none of his business. Trouble was a rattlesnake best left unprovoked. He had his own ghost to wrestle. He didn't need another's demons. He learned the hard way that getting involved only brought more pain. But that bruise, purple and angry, stark against the flour, wasn't something he could unsee. It was a violation etched on his skin, a silent scream in the quiet kitchen. It mirrored the older, deeper bruises on his own soul. The memory of Clara, pale and fragile in their bed, a similar mottling on her wrist after that drifter. Silas crushed the thought. The cold coffee sloshing over the rim of his mug onto the weathered porch boards. He hadn't been able to save Clara. The drifter had vanished like smoke. The guilt was a stone lodged permanently in his chest. He spent the day wrestling with a bulky water pump down by the creek, the rhythmic screech and clank failing to drown out the image of Martha's arm. The wind whipped across the flats, carrying the lonely cry of a hawk. Sagebrush trembled. The creek gurgled over smooth stones, indifferent. He watched the water swirl, remembering Clara's laughter as Ben splashed in a shallower bend years ago. The ache was a physical thing, a hollow beneath his ribs. He'd built walls around that pain, thick and high. Martha's bruises were a chisel tapping against his own carefully constructed silence. Dinner was venison stew, thick and savory, with biscuits so light they seemed to defy the harsh landscape. Martha served him silently, her movements economical. She wore a long-sleeved shirt now under her apron, the cuffs buttoned tight at her wrists. The deliberate concealance was louder than any accusation. Silas ate slowly, the food turning to ash in his mouth. He watched her move between stove and sink, her profile sharp in the flickering light of the kerosene lamp. He saw the tightness around her eyes, the way she held her jaw clenched even when she thought no one was looking. A quiet defiance radiated from her, not loud, but deep like the roots of the ancient cottonwood by the graves. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She froze, a tin plate halfway to the drying rack. That pump down by the creek, he began, his voice rough from disuse. Gave me fits today. It was a pathetic opening, a coward's path. He saw her shoulders relax minutely. Safe territory. They do that, she murmured, not turning around, scrubbing the plate with fierce concentration. Silas pushed his empty bowl away. The lamplight caught the lines around his eyes, the premature gray at his temples. He took a breath, the air thick with the scent of stew and wood smoke and something else. Fear, maybe. His own. Hers. Saw your arm earlier, he said, the words dropping into the stillness like stones into a pond. When he was kneading, that bruise. Martha went utterly still. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the stove and the relentless wind moaning under the eaves. She didn't turn. Her knuckles, gripping the plate, were white. Slipped, she said, the word clipped, final. Reaching for the sugar. Hit the cupboard latch. It was a flimsy story. The latch was smooth brass, not capable of leaving such a distinct, hand-spanning mark. Silas leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the oilcloth-covered table. The rough texture grounded him. He remembered the drifter's sneer, the way he dismissed Clara's complaint. Clumsy woman. The same dismissive cruelty echoed in Martha's deflection. Looked like more in a latch, he said, keeping his voice low, steady. Not accusing, observing. Looks like a hand. She flinched as if struck. The plate clattered into the sink. Finally, slowly, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark in the lamplight. Not with tears, but with a kind of hunted terror. Her gaze met his for a fleeting, electric second. He saw the raw fear, yes, but also a flash of something else. Shame, desperation, and beneath it a spark of fierce, unbroken will. "Ain't your business, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice trembling despite the steel beneath it. Her eyes darted towards the kitchen window, blackened by the night outside. Some things are best left buried. For everyone's sake. Her hand unconsciously rubbed the spot on her arm, hidden by the sleeve. Trouble comes looking, it finds you. Don't need it finding this place. The quiet intensity in her words, The way she looked out into the darkness sent a chill down Silas's spine that had nothing to do with the wind. It wasn't just fear of the past. It was fear of something present, something out there. His own ingrained instinct screamed to retreat, to rebuild the wall. The memory of Clara's broken whisper, "Don't go after him, Silas, please," warred with the vivid purple stain on Martha's arm. He opened his mouth, unsure what would come out. Reassurance, dismissal, a demand for the truth he wasn't sure he could handle. But before he could speak, a sound cut through the night, sharp and alien against the familiar symphony of wind and creaking timbers. Clink! It came from outside, near the barn. Distinct, metallic, like a spur brushing against stone or a hoof striking a loose bit of harness left on the ground. Martha heard it too. Her breath hitched, a tiny, strangled gasp. The blood drained from her face, leaving her ashen. The hunted look in her eyes intensified, pure animal terror replacing the defiance. She took a stumbling step back, pressing herself against the cold iron of the stove, her gaze locked on the black rectangle of the kitchen window. Silas was on his feet in an instant, the chair scraping harshly on the plank floor. His hand instinctively dropped to the worn walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Years of solitude, of listening to the sounds of the prairie night, told him this wasn't a coyote, not a stray cow. That sound didn't belong. He moved silently to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. He peered out, his eyes straining against the deep velvet blackness beyond the weak halo of lantern light spilling from the porch. The wind tugged at the barn door, making it groan. The corral fence posts stood like sentinels. And then he saw it. Near the corner of the barn, with a lantern light barely reached, a shadow moved. Not the swaying dance of sagebrush. Bulkier, deliberate, and beside it, glinting dully for a fraction of a second before being swallowed by the darkness, was the unmistakable, cold gleam of starlight on a rifle barrel. The glint of starlight on cold steel vanished as swiftly as it appeared, swallowed by the shifting blackness near the barn corner. Silas Thorne didn't breathe. His fingers tightened on the worn walnut grip of his Colt, the leather holster creaking softly against his thigh. Beside him, pressed against the iron stove, Martha Croft was a statue carved from fear, her eyes wide, unblinking pools of terror fixed on the window. The wind chose that moment to howl a fresh complaint under the eaves, rattling the loose pane in its frame, masking any further sound from outside. Trouble comes looking, it finds you. Her words echoed in the sudden, brittle silence of the kitchen, thick with the scent of stew gone cold and the acrid tang of kerosene. The shadow had moved with purpose. That rifle barrel hadn't been a trick of the light. Someone was out there, watching. Silas held up a hand, palm flat towards Martha. "Stay silent." Her breath hitched again, a tiny, ragged sound. He moved with the ingrained caution of a man who'd navigated predator and prey on these plains, easing away from the window frame, keeping to the deeper shadows along the wall. The lamplight from the table cast long, dancing shapes, turning familiar objects into looming threats. He reached the back door, a heavy slab of oak braced against the Wyoming elements. Slowly, silently, he slid the thick iron bolt back. The rasp of metal on metal sounded thunderous in the quiet room. Martha flinched. He cracked the door open just enough to slip through, the wind immediately buffeting him, carrying the chill bite of approaching frost and the dry, peppery scent of sagebrush. The night air was vast, velvet black, pricked only by icy stars and the weak yellow halo spilling from the porch lantern 30 feet away. The wind moaned across the corral, making the gate chains clink a mournful tune. Sagebrush trembled like nervous ghosts in the faint light. Silas melted into the deeper darkness beside the house, his back pressed against the rough-hewn logs. His senses strained. Every rustle of dry grass, every groan of stressed timber was amplified. He scanned the yard, the barn, the silhouette of the water pump against the starry expanse. Nothing moved but the wind-tossed shadows. He remembered the metallic clink. Spurs? A hoof on metal? His gaze swept the ground near the barn corner where he'd seen the shadow. The packed earth, scoured by wind, revealed little. He needed a better angle. Keeping low, he skirted the edge of the yard, using the well housing for cover, then darted across the open space to the relative shelter of the corral fence. The wood was rough and cold beneath his palms. Peering between the top rails, he scanned the barn's length. The big double doors were slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. Had he left them like that? He couldn't recall. Usually, he barred them against coyotes and the occasional curious bear. A prickle ran up his spine. He focused on the gap. Darkness yawned within. Was something moving in there? A shape deeper than the surrounding gloom? Or just his eyes playing tricks, conjuring threats from the remnants of fear and Martha's palpable terror? He thought of Clara, not the fragile ghost in the sickbed, but Clara vibrant, fierce. The day that drifter, Jed Hawkins, had gotten too familiar near the creek, his hand snaking out to grab her wrist. Silas had been mending fence, seen it from the ridge. He'd run, heart hammering like a runaway stallion, arriving just as Clara wrenched free, her face flushed with anger, not fear. She'd spat a curse at Hawkins that would have blistered paint. Silas had stepped between them, his own fury a cold, hard thing. Hawkins, seeing the look in Silas's eyes and the rifle suddenly very present in his hands, had backed down, muttering excuses, slinking away. Clara hadn't wanted him pursued. He's not worth the lead, Silas, or the trouble he'd bring back. He'd listen then. He'd let the snakes slither away. And the guilt of that inaction, the feeling he hadn't done enough, had festered alongside his grief after the fever took her. Had that moment of caution somehow doomed her? A foolish thought, perhaps, but it lived in him, sharp as a thorn. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Not with another woman trembling in his kitchen. Not with that purple storm cloud bruise on Martha's arm. Trouble had found the box tea. He wouldn't turn his back on it this time. Silas drew his Colt. The weight was familiar, solid. He thumbed back the hammer, the click a tiny punctuation in the wind-scoured silence. He moved towards the barn doors, stepping lightly, placing each boot with deliberate care on the packed earth. The gap between the doors was wider now, a slash of deeper black. He paused at the edge, listening. Only the wind, sighing through the cracks in the walls. The scent of old hay, dust, and horse sweat drifted out. Taking a breath, he stepped quickly inside, flattening himself against the rough interior wall just beyond the door. He scanned the cavernous space. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the roof, casting dusty silver beams that illuminated motes dancing in the air. The stalls were empty. His two workhorses were in the corral for the night. The wagon sat like a sleeping beast. Tools hung on pegs. Bales of hay were stacked near the back. Nothing seemed disturbed. No lurking figure. No glint of metal. He moved deeper, checking behind the wagon, peering into the empty stalls, his Colt leading the way. His boots scuffed something near the back wall, close to where he'd seen the shadow outside. He knelt, fingers probing the dirt floor. Not a stone. Something cylindrical, thin. He picked it up, holding it into a shaft of moonlight. A cigarette stub, rolled thin, with cheap, dark paper. Not his brand. He never smoked inside the barn. This was fresh, the end still slightly damp where it had been pinched out. Someone had been here. Recently. Watching the house. Had they been inside? He checked the small tack room. Nothing seemed missing. The grain bin lid was secure. But the feeling of violation was acute. This was his sanctuary, his hard-won piece of the world. Someone had trespassed, breathed his air, left their mark. He pocketed the stub, a cold knot of anger tightening in his gut. He barred the barn doors from the inside, the heavy timber thudding solidly into place. It felt like a feeble defense against the vast, watchful night. Back in the kitchen, Martha hadn't moved. She still stood rigid by the stove, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the cold iron. The lantern light etched deep lines of strain around her mouth and eyes. She flinched when he re-entered, her gaze darting past him to the closed door, then back to his face, searching. Well, the single word was barely audible, scraped raw. "Nobody there now," Silas said, holstering his Colt. The weight of the cigarette stub in his pocket felt heavy. He saw the flicker of disbelief in her eyes, quickly masked. She knew better. Found this. He held out the damp cigarette stub. Back corner. Fresh. She stared at it, as if it were a rattlesnake coiled in his palm. A tremor ran through her, starting in her shoulders and ending in her clenched hands. She didn't touch it. Her gaze lifted to his, and for the first time, the hunted terror was mingled with a desperate, weary resignation. "See," she whispered, "they find you. Even here." "Who, Martha?" Silas asked, his voice low but insistent. He stepped closer, the worn oilcloth of the table between them. "Who finds you? Who left that bruise?" He gestured towards her arm, though the sleeve covered it now. She shrank back, hugging herself. Don't matter who, just they're connected. To two powerful people. The words seemed to cost her immense effort. Places like Red River. She spat the name like a curse, her voice gaining a bitter edge. "You think a rancher out here alone can stand against that? You think I can?" Her defiance was back, brittle now, edged with despair. Just let it lie, Mr. Thorne. Please, for your sake. Mine too." She turned abruptly, grabbing a dish rag, scrubbing fiercely at the already clean sink, her shoulders rigid with tension. Red River. The name meant nothing specific to Silas, just a vague notion of a larger settlement a couple days' ride southeast, known more for cattle drives passing through than anything else. But the way she said it, the venom and the fear, it hinted at a reach, an influence that stretched far beyond the sagebrush flats surrounding the box tee. He watched her scrub, the frantic motion belying her plea for inaction. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she kept glancing towards the window. He saw, too, the stubborn set of her jaw, the fierce will that refused to be entirely extinguished, even by this bone-deep fear. She was strong, this quiet woman, stronger than she knew, stronger, perhaps, than she wanted to be. Silas didn't push further. He knew walls when he saw them. Instead, he picked up the heavy iron poker leaning by the stove. "Bar the door after I go out," he said, his voice gruff. "Front and back. I'll check the perimeter. Won't sleep much tonight anyway." He saw a flicker of surprise, then a sliver of something else, reluctant gratitude, in her eyes before she looked down, nodding mutely. He lit the storm lantern hanging by the door, its glass chimney throwing shifting, distorted shadows on the walls as he lifted it. The wind snatched at the flame as he opened the door, making it gutter wildly. He spent the next hour walking the boundaries of the house yard, the lantern held high, casting its small, defiant circle of light against the immense dark. He checked the corral, the pump house, the woodpile. He found nothing else amiss. No tracks distinct enough in the hard-packed earth. No sign of a horse tethered nearby. It was as if the shadow and the rifle barrel had been phantoms, conjured by fear and the lonely wind. Except for the damp cigarette stub burning a hole in his pocket. Red River. Powerful people. The words echoed in his head, mixing with the howl of the wind and the remembered feel of Clara's hand growing cold in his. He stopped by the lone cottonwood, the grave stark humps in the lantern light. He wasn't a praying man, not anymore. But he stood there, the wind tearing at his coat, the lantern flame fighting against the dark, and made a silent promise to the ghosts beneath the stones and to the frightened woman barricaded in his house. He wouldn't let the snakes slither away this time. Whatever was coming, whoever was watching, he'd face it. He'd failed Clara by letting fear dictate caution. He wouldn't fail Martha. He returned to the house as the first gray fingers of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The wind had lessened, leaving an eerie stillness. He knocked softly on the heavy oak door. He heard the scrape of the bar being lifted inside. Martha opened it, her face pale and drawn in the gloom of the unlit kitchen, her eyes enormous and shadowed. She held a cast-iron skillet like a weapon. "All quiet," Silas said, stepping inside, the chill of the night clinging to him. He barred the door again. The tension in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Martha lowered the skillet slowly, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. The shared vigil, the unspoken understanding of the threat, had forged a fragile, temporary bridge between them. "Coffee," she rasped, turning towards the stove, her movements slow, mechanical. She filled the pot, her hands shaking only slightly now. Silas sank into a chair at the table, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He watched her build up the fire in the stove, the small, mundane act a strange counterpoint to the fear that still hung in the air. The sun was just cresting the distant Wind River range, painting the sagebrush flats in hues of rose and gold. When Jed Carter's supply wagon rattled up the track, a plume of dust rising behind it like a lazy brown serpent. Jed, a grizzled man with a perpetual squint and a tobacco-stained beard, hauled on the reins, bringing the team to a halt near the porch. "Mornin', Silas," he called, his voice unnaturally loud in the dawn stillness. "Got your flour, salt, and that harness leather you ordered." He climbed down, stretching his back. Martha, who had been sweeping the porch, froze, the broom clutched tight. Her face, turned towards Jed, went ashen. Silas, stepping out to meet Jed, saw it. Saw the way her knuckles whitened on the broom handle. Saw the flicker of pure, unadulterated panic in her eyes before she quickly looked down, resuming her sweeping with furious, jerky strokes. Jed tipped his hat towards her. "Mornin', Miss Croft. You're looking peaked. This high country air talk ain't some getting used to." Martha didn't look up. "Mornin', Mr. Carter," she mumbled, the words barely audible. She swept the same patch of porch boards over and over. Jed shrugged, turning his attention back to Silas, unloading sacks from the wagon bed. "Quiet night?" he asked casually, hefting a sack of flour onto his shoulder. Silas's gaze was still fixed on Martha. Her reaction to Jed was visceral, primal fear. But Jed? He was just old Jed, the reliable, if slightly grumpy, supply runner. Or was he? The cigarette stub. Jed smoked, rolled his own, usually with lighter paper, Silas thought. But in the dark. "Quiet enough," Silas replied, his voice carefully neutral. He helped Jed unload, his mind racing. Was Jed the threat? Or was Martha afraid Jed carried news? Or was it simply that any outsider now represented danger? Jed dropped the last sack by the porch steps and wiped his brow. He leaned closer to Silas, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur, his eyes flicking towards Martha, who was now vigorously beating a rug over the porch rail, her back turned. "Heard some talk down at the Crossroads store yesterday," Jed said, his tone low and serious. "Feller a skin after a woman. Matched Martha's description pretty close. Said she was needed back home. Urgent family business. Down Red River way." Jed's weathered face was grim. Didn't like the look of him, Silas. Were the two hard cases riding with him? Had that settled sort of meanness. Asked real pointed about ranches out this direction. Silas felt a cold certainty wash over him. The shadow, the rifle, the cigarette, Red River. It wasn't paranoia. The hunt was real, and it had followed Martha Croft to his doorstep. Before Silas could respond, before he could even process the implications of Jed's words, Martha let out a small, choked gasp. The rug beater clattered to the porch boards. Silas and Jed both turned. Martha was staring past them down the long track leading away from the ranch house. Her hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with fresh terror, fixed on a point just beyond the rise where the trail dipped towards the creek. Following her gaze, Silas saw it. 3 riders, silhouetted starkly against the rising sun, sitting motionless on their horses at the crest of the distant ridge. Watching, one of them lifted a hand, slowly, deliberately, pointing towards the Box T Ranch house. The rider's pointed finger felt like a physical blow striking the Box T. Silas Thorne's blood turned to ice water, then surged hot. Beside him, Jed Carter muttered a low curse, his grizzled face tightening. Martha Croft stood frozen on the porch, the rug beater forgotten at her feet, one hand still pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide and hollow with a terror that seemed to leach the color from the dawn itself. The three figures, stark black cutouts against the molten gold bleeding across the eastern sky, held their position on the distant ridge. Watching, assessing. Red River, powerful people, needed back home. Jed's words slammed into Silas's consciousness with the force of a runaway steer. This wasn't random. This was the shadow from the barn made flesh. The damp cigarette stub in his pocket felt like a burning coal. Silas. Jed's voice was a rasp, urgent. That's trouble sitting right there. Those ain't drifters looking for work. I see him, Jed, Silas replied, his voice unnaturally calm. His gaze never left the riders. His hand rested lightly on the worn walnut grip of his Colt. The familiar weight was a small anchor in the sudden, sickening tilt of the world. The vast Wyoming morning, painted in rose and gold, felt abruptly claustrophobic, the sagebrush flats shrinking to the distance between his porch and that ominous ridge. Martha made a small, choked sound. She stumbled back a step, her shoulder bumping the porch post. The contact seemed to jolt her. Her eyes, fixed on the riders, held the trapped animal panic Silas had seen in the kitchen the night before. But beneath it, something else flickered, a desperate, flailing calculation. Get inside, Martha, Silas ordered, his tone low but brooking no argument. He didn't look at her, couldn't afford to take his eyes off the ridge. Bar the door. She moved then, a jerky, uncoordinated scramble. The heavy oak door thudded shut behind her. A moment later, he heard the solid thunk of the iron bar sliding home. A small, fragile line of defense drawn. Jed shifted his weight, his hand drifting towards the worn holster on his own hip. Reckon I should mosey on? Don't want to be caught in the crossfire if them boys decide to ride down. Silas finally tore his gaze from the ridge, looking at the older man. Jed's face was etched with genuine concern, but also the pragmatic caution of a man who delivered goods, not bullets. Appreciate the warning, Jed, Silas said. You best go. Take the back trail past the creek, skirt wide. No sense drawing their notice to you. Jed nodded, relief warring with unease in his eyes. He cast one last, worried glance at the ridge, then at the shuttered house. You watch yourself, Silas. That kind they play for keeps. He climbed swiftly back onto his wagon seat, gathered the reins, and with a sharp hi-ya, sent the team jangling off towards the creek path, dust pluming behind the wheels in the still air. Silas was alone in the yard. The wind, momentarily stilled, picked up again, sighing through the sagebrush, carrying the dry, peppery scent and the faint, lonely cry of a meadowlark. A cruel mockery of peace. He remained standing by the porch steps, a solitary figure facing the distant threat. He didn't draw his Colt. Not yet. Drawing meant a line crossed. He kept his hands loose at his sides, projecting a calm he didn't feel. Inside, the silence from the house was profound. Martha was a ghost behind the thick logs. Minutes stretched, taut as a bowstring. The riders didn't move. Silas's mind raced. 3 against 1. An isolated ranch. The memory of Clara, not in anger this time, but in her final, fading moments, surfaced with painful clarity. The heat of her skin under his hand, the labored rasp of her breath, little Ben already still and cold in the crib beside them. The crushing helplessness, the guilt that whispered, if only. If only he'd been stronger, faster, richer, maybe a doctor could have reached them in time. If only he'd run Jed Hawkins off the land entirely. Maybe Clara wouldn't have been down by the creek alone that day the fever took hold, foolish thoughts, tangled roots of grief. But the core truth remained. Helplessness was a poison. He'd swallowed it once. He wouldn't swallow it again, watching another woman be dragged back to God knew what. Martha's defiance, brittle as it was, deserved more than silent surrender. Suddenly, one of the riders nudged his horse forward, not charging, but walking it deliberately down the gentle slope towards the ranch. A single rider, separating from the others who remained like sentinels on the ridge. Sunlight glinted off a bit in the horse's mouth, flashed on a concho on the rider's saddle. He rode with a loose, easy confidence that spoke of a man accustomed to being obeyed. As he drew closer, Silas could make out details. A dark, broad-brimmed hat pulled low, a long duster coat despite the warming day, a rifle resting casually across the saddle horn. His face was shadowed, unreadable. Silas didn't move. He let the rider come, closing the distance across the flat expanse of hard-packed earth and silver-green sage. The rhythmic thud of hooves grew louder, a slow, ominous drumbeat. The scent of horse sweat and dust reached Silas. The rider stopped about 50 yards out, a respectful distance, but close enough for his voice to carry clearly in the stillness. "Mornin'," the rider called out. His voice was smooth, almost pleasant, but with an underlying hardness, like gravel under velvet. "Fine piece of land you got here, Mr. Thorne," Silas replied, his voice flat. "Silas Thorne. This is the box tee." "Thorne." The rider tipped his hat back slightly, revealing a lean, weathered face, clean-shaven, with sharp, calculating eyes the color of flint. A thin scar traced a pale line from his temple down towards his jawline. He smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Name's Corbin. Elias Corbin. We're looking for someone. A woman. Heard she might be working here." Silas felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He kept his gaze steady. "Lots of women folk pass through Wyoming. What's this one look like?" Corbin's smile remained fixed. Brown hair, sun-bleached some. Thin, early 30s. Got a way of disappearing. "Name's Martha Croft." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. "Her family's powerful worried. Sent us to fetch her home. Back to Red River. Urgent family business." The way he said urgent carried a subtle, chilling weight. Inside the house, Silas imagined Martha hearing every word. Pressed against the door, her breath held. He thought of the bruise, purple-black beneath her sleeve. Family business. The lie was as thick as river mud. "Ain't seen her," Silas stated, his tone devoid of inflection. The lie came easier than he expected. Protecting her felt like the only solid ground left. "Cook I got is a widow named Smith. Been here a spell." Corbin chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. "Is that so? Widow Smith." He shifted slightly in the saddle, the leather creaking. "See, that's curious. Because information has a way of traveling, Mr. Thorne. Especially when money talks. We got reliable word she stepped off Jed Carter's wagon right here, near on a month back." He nodded towards the fading dust plume marking Jed's retreat. "Old Jed carries more in just flour and harness leather, wouldn't you say? Carries news, carries observations." Silas's stomach clenched. Jed hadn't betrayed them maliciously, he was sure, but his loose talk at the Crossroads store had been a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to Martha's door. Trust was a luxury the box T couldn't afford. "People see what they want to see." "Corbin," Silas countered, keeping his voice level. "Or what they're paid to see. Woman working for me is named Smith. She minds her business. I mind mine. This is my land." Corbin's flinty eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The pleasant mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold predator beneath. "Land can change hands quick in these parts, Mr. Thorne, especially when trouble comes calling." "And trouble," he let the word hang. "It's got a way of fending folks who harbor runaways, even well-meaning ranchers." He patted the stock of his rifle. "We're just messengers, polite ones. We prefer to take the lady and be on our way." peaceful-like. Save everyone a heap of bother. The threat was clear, veiled in civility. Silas felt the familiar cold knot of anger tighten in his gut, mixed now with a rising tide of protectiveness. This man, with his smooth talk and hard eyes, represented everything that had put the fear in Martha that had marked her skin. Silas's hand itched for the Colt, but he kept it still. Drawing now meant bloodshed, and bloodshed meant Martha caught in the middle. Like I said, Silas repeated, his voice hardening slightly, ain't no Martha Croft here. You're wasting your time. And mine. A long moment stretched. The wind sighed. A horse on the ridge stamped impatiently. Corbin studied Silas, his gaze sweeping over the ranch house, the barn, the corral, as if assessing its defenses, its vulnerabilities. His eyes lingered for a beat on the lone cottonwood by the creek, the two simple stone markers visible beneath its branches. Silas felt a fresh wave of cold fury. The violation deepened. Finally, Corbin gave a slow, deliberate nod. The false smile returned. All right, Mr. Thorne, we hear you. Loud and clear. He gathered his reins. We'll be camped back by the ridge. Give you some time to reconsider. Talk to your widow Smith. Make sure there ain't no confusion. Family wants her back, real bad, and they don't take kindly to delays. He nudged his horse, turning it slowly. Sun's gonna be fierce today. Hope you got water enough for everyone. He touched the brim of his hat. We'll be seeing you. He rode back towards the ridge at the same unhurried pace, not looking back. The other two riders wheeled their horses and followed him as he crested the rise. For a few seconds, their silhouettes were stark against the sky again. Then they dropped down out of sight, vanishing as suddenly as they'd appeared. The vast Wyoming landscape swallowed them, leaving only dust motes dancing in the sunlight and the oppressive weight of their presence. Silas stood rooted for another minute, the silence roaring in his ears. The scent of dust and sagebrush was suddenly suffocating. He turned slowly towards the house. The heavy bar scraped inside, and the door opened a crack. Martha stood there, pale as milk, her eyes huge and dark with terror, but also a flicker of desperate hope. She clutched a heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand, white-knuckled. They gone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "For now," Silas said, the words tasting like ash. He walked toward the porch, his boots heavy on the steps. He saw the tremor running through her, the way she braced herself against the door frame. He also saw the skillet, held not just for defense, but like a lifeline, a small, fierce refusal. He stopped before her. The shared fear, the shared defiance in the face of Corbin's smooth menace, hung thick between them. He needed answers. "Now, who are they, Martha?" he asked, his voice low but intense. "Who sent Corbin? What family business drags men like that across Wyoming?" He gestured towards the ridge. "That Bruise, it's them, ain't it? Or the one they work for?" Martha flinched at the mention of the Bruise, her free hand instinctively moving towards her arm. She looked down, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The terror was back, threatening to drown her. She shook her head, a frantic, desperate motion. "You don't understand. You can't." "Make me understand," Silas insisted, stepping closer. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a demand. "They're camped on my land, Martha, pointing rifles at my home, threatening me over you. I got a right to know what snake hole I'm standing on." He thought of Corbin's gaze lingering on the graves. They know about Clara, about Ben. They ain't just messengers. They're a warning. The mention of his buried family shattered something in her. A sob escaped, harsh and ragged. She looked up, tears welling but not falling, her eyes filled with a raw anguish that went beyond her own fear. "It's not family," she choked out, the words torn from her. It's him, Harlan Gage." She spat the name like poison. "He owns everything near Red River. The mines, the stores, the law, some say. He wanted things I wouldn't give. Things no decent woman should." She shuddered, hugging herself, I ran, thought I could disappear. But he, her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. He finds people. He breaks them, or breaks anyone who tries to help them. Her gaze locked onto Silas's, pleading, terrified. You see why you have to let me go? Before he breaks you too? Before he... Her eyes flickered past him towards the cottonwood, the meaning horrifyingly clear. Before he desecrated the graves. Before he erased Silas Thorne from his own land. Silas stared at her, the name Harlan Gage settling like a cold stone in his gut. A man who owned lawmen. A man who sent polished predators like Corbin. The scale of the threat was staggering. A tidal wave threatening to engulf his isolated world. The fear was real, a physical pressure in his chest. But looking at Martha, seeing the stark terror mixed with that fierce, unyielding core of will that refused to be entirely extinguished, even now, something solidified within him. He'd run from Jed Hawkins out of caution, out of Clara's plea. That caution had bought nothing but grief. Running wasn't an option this time. Not for him, not for her. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and desperation. I ain't letting you go, Martha, he said, his voice rough but firm. And I ain't letting Gage break nothing else on this land. He turned, scanning the horizon where the riders had vanished. We need water. They'll expect me to go to the creek. He moved towards the barn, his mind already shifting from the paralyzing fear to the grim calculus of survival. He needed his rifle. He needed to see how close they'd camped. He needed a plan, fragile as it might be. Martha followed him a few steps into the yard, the skillet still hanging from her hand, looking lost and terrified. Silas, she started, her voice trembling. He paused, looking back at her. The rising sun caught the tracks of moisture on her dusty cheeks, the fierce determination warring with despair in her eyes. It was the most vulnerable he'd ever seen her. Bar the door again, he said, gentler this time. I'll be careful. Just need to see. He pushed open the barn door, stepping into the cool, hay-scented dimness. He moved towards the back wall, where his Winchester leaned in its rack beside the worn harness. As he reached for the rifle, his boots scuffed against something on the packed dirt floor near the spot where he'd found the cigarette stub. Not another stub. Something small and dark. He bent down, picking it up. It was a button. A fancy one, made of smooth, dark horn or polished wood, unlike the simple bone or tin buttons on his own clothes. It was carved with a tiny, intricate design, a stylized letter G. Silas stared at it, cold dread washing over him anew. It hadn't been there when he barred the barn after finding the cigarette. Someone had been inside. Again, while he was facing Corbin in the yard, while Martha was alone in the house. They hadn't just watched from a ridge. They'd been here, close, slipping into his barn like ghosts, leaving a calling card. He clenched the button in his fist, the carved G biting into his palm. Harlan Gage wasn't just sending messengers. He was already here, touching Silas's life, violating his space with terrifying ease. The fragile sense of having drawn a line shattered. The barn door, which he'd left slightly ajar for light, suddenly felt like an open invitation to death. A floorboard creaked softly behind him. Silas whirled, the Winchester half-raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't Martha. The figure standing just inside the barn door, silhouetted against the bright rectangle of daylight, was tall, lean, and wearing a long duster. Elias Corbin's flinty eyes met his, and the man offered a slow, chilling smile, his hand resting casually near the butt of his holstered revolver. "Forgot my hat, Mr. Thorne," Corbin said smoothly, his gaze flicking to the button clenched in Silas's fist. "Seems you found something of mine." The carved G button bit into Silas Thorne's palm like a shard of ice. Corbin's smile was a knife in the dim barn light, his hand hovering near his revolver, the lie about the forgotten hat hanging thin and brittle in the air. The scent of old hay and dust suddenly felt thick, suffocating. Silas's fingers tightened on the Winchester stock, the wood grained familiar against his skin. a counterpoint to the cold dread solidifying in his gut. He hadn't heard Corbin approach. Not a creak, not a whisper. The man moved like smoke. Harlan Gage wasn't just sending messengers. He was already here. Seems careless, Silas managed, his voice grating. He didn't lower the rifle, though he kept the muzzle pointed at the packed earth floor between them. A deliberate non-threat that screamed tension. Losing buttons, slipping into a man's barn uninvited. He opened his fist slightly, letting the button catch the dusty shaft of light from the open door. The intricate G seemed to pulse. Corbin's flinty eyes flickered, a spark of annoyance quickly masked by that unnerving calm. He took a slow step further inside, his spurs giving a soft, deliberate ching. The sound echoed in the stillness. A man gets curious, Mr. Thorne, especially when he's delivering a message and gets met with misunderstandings. His gaze swept the barn again, lingering on the stalls, the wagon, the stacked hay bales near the back wall. Assessing, cataloging weaknesses. Powerful folk like Mr. Gage, they value clarity. They don't take kindly to folks muddying the waters, or harboring what's theirs. Silas felt a surge of cold anger, cutting through the fear. Theirs. The word, applied to Martha, ignited something primal. He thought of Martha's bruise, the terror in her eyes, the fierce, trapped defiance. He thought of Clara, vibrant Clara, reduced to a ghost by fever, but before that, by his own moment of hesitation with Jed Hawkins. He'd let the snake slither away out of caution, out of Clara's plea for peace. That caution hadn't saved her. It had only left a festering wound of regret. He wouldn't make that mistake with Martha. Not with polished snakes like Corbin slithering through his barn. "This is my water," Silas stated, the words low and hard as river stone. "My barn, my land. What's under my roof is my concern. Not Gage's, not yours." He shifted his weight, the Winchester held steady. Message was delivered, loud and clear. "Now you can ride out. Same way you came in. Quiet-like." Corbin's smile tightened, losing its last veneer of pleasantry. The predator gleamed through. He took another step, close enough now that Silas could smell the stale tobacco and leather scent clinging to him. "See, that's where you're mistaken, Thorne. What Gage wants is his concern. Always. And right now, he wants Martha Croft. Peaceful return avoids unpleasantness. For everyone." His eyes flicked pointedly towards the house, then back to Silas. "You got nice, quiet graves out there under that tree. Real peaceful. Be ashamed to disturb him, or fill him prematurely." The threat to Clara and Ben's resting place was a physical blow. Silas's knuckles went white on the rifle stock. The urge to raise it, to end this slick menace right here in the hay-scented gloom, was a roaring pressure in his skull. But he saw Corbin's relaxed posture, the readiness coiled beneath the duster. Drawing down now meant a shootout in a confined space. Bullets could rip through the thin barn walls towards the house, towards Martha. He forced a breath, icy air scraping his lungs. "Not like Hawkins. Not this time. You step 1 foot closer to that house, Corbin," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "and peaceful stops being an option. You want Martha? You come through me, and I ain't as easy to break as you reckon." A long, taut silence stretched. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through the door. Somewhere outside, a horse blew softly in the corral. Corbin's eyes narrowed, calculating the resolve in Silas's stance, the unwavering line of the Winchester. He saw no bluff, only the hard, cold certainty of a man pushed to the edge of his land, guarding what was left of his world. Slowly, deliberately, Corbin raised his empty hands, palms out, a mockery of surrender. "All right, Thorne. Point taken. For now." He took a single step back towards the door, his movements fluid, controlled. "But understand this. Gage's patience wears thin quick. Sun's high. Water's low." He nodded towards the creek, invisible beyond their eyes. "You'll need it. For the stock. For yourselves." He touched the brim of his hat again, the gesture dripping with contempt. "We'll be watching. Enjoy the sunshine while it lasts." He turned and walked out, his back exposed but radiating utter confidence. Silas tracked him with a rifle's sight until Corbin mounted his horse near the corral and rode unhurriedly back towards the distant ridge. Only when the rider was a small, dark speck against the sagebrush did Silas lower the Winchester. His shoulders slumped momentarily, the adrenaline crash leaving him trembling. He looked down at the G-button still clutched in his hand. A brand, a promise. He barred the barn door with a heavy timber, the thud a hollow echo in the suddenly empty space. The violation lingered like a bad smell. Pocketing the button, he grabbed the Winchester and headed back towards the house, scanning the horizon constantly. The vast Wyoming sky, usually a comfort, felt like an open eye, watching. Martha flung the door open before he reached the porch. She stood there, the cast-iron skillet still in hand, her face a mask of terror. "What happened?" "He came back. I saw him ride from the barn." "Did he?" "He left something," Silas said grimly, stepping inside. He closed the door and slid the bar home. The familiar kitchen felt like a besieged fort. He pulled the button from his pocket and laid it on the scarred pine table. The carved G seemed to dominate the room. "Slipped in while we were talking outside. Left this. Like marking territory." Martha stared at the button as if it were a live rattler. A choked sob escaped her. She sank into a chair, the skillet clattering to the floor, her shoulders shaking. "It's him," she whispered, her voice raw. "Gage's mark. He's claiming you. Like he claims everything." She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. "He knows you won't yield. He'll break you, burn you out, make you watch." Her eyes darted to the window, towards the cottonwood. "Like he did to others." Silas poured 2 tin cups of water from the pitcher on the sideboard, his movements methodical, a counterpoint to the turmoil inside. He pushed 1 cup towards Martha. "Drink." He sat down heavily opposite her, the Winchester leaning against the table leg. "Tell me about the others." Martha flinched, clutching the cup but not drinking. Her gaze remained fixed on a button. "A storekeeper in Red River," she began, her voice a monotone scraped raw. "Tried to stand up to Gage over prices. Gage undercut him, spread lies, then his store burned. With him inside. Folks said it was an accident." She shuddered. "A miner found a rich vein on land Gage wanted. Miner disappeared. His body turned up weeks later in a coyote den." She looked up at Silas, her eyes pools of haunted darkness. "He doesn't fight fair. He owns the shadows. The law looks the other way. Money buys silence. Or screams." She took a shuddering sip of water. "I try to run because staying meant becoming nothing. A thing he used. I'd rather die out here, free for a moment, than live like that again." Her quiet confession, the raw despair mixed with that unkillable spark of defiance, resonated deep within Silas's grief-scarred soul. He saw Clara's fierce spirit reflected in Martha's refusal to be broken. He saw the cost of inaction etched in Martha's bruises and in the phantom ache where Clara's laughter used to be. "You ain't dying out here, Martha," he said, the words firm, surprising even himself. "And he ain't burning me out. We got water to fetch, stock to tend. Life goes on, even under watch." He stood, picking up the Winchester. Corbin mentioned water, pointed to the creek. "They know we need it. Might be expecting an ambush there." He looked at her, a plan, fragile as spider silk, forming. "I'll go. Need to check the pump anyway. You stay here." Barden, eyes sharp, panic flared in Martha's eyes. "No, Silas, it's a trap. They'll be waiting." "Likely," he agreed, his voice calm. "But letting the stock go thirsty weakens us faster. I ain't giving them that edge. I'll go careful. Use the creek bank cover." He saw the fear warring with understanding in her face. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, and placed his hand over hers where it clutched the tin cup. Her skin was cold. He felt the fine tremors running through her. "Need you watching my back from here, Martha. See anyone moving on the ridge, you signal." 2 quick raps on the doorframe. Loud, The simple touch, the shared responsibility, was a lifeline thrown across the chasm of their fear. Martha looked down at his calloused hand covering hers, then up at his face. The hunted terror was still there, but beneath it, something kindled, a fragile ember of trust, of shared purpose. She nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. 2 wraps, she whispered. I'll watch. Every second. Silas gave her hand a brief squeeze, then released it, the contact leaving an unexpected warmth against the chill dread. He checked the Colt at his hip, hefted the Winchester, and slipped out the back door, moving low and fast toward the cover of the woodpile before angling towards the creek path. The sun was high now, beating down, turning the sagebrush silver gray and leaching the color from the distant Wind River peaks. The air shimmered with heat. Silence pressed down, heavy and watchful. He moved like a shadow himself, using every dip in the land, every clump of sage, every rock. His senses screamed, scanning the ridge line, the open flats, the brush along the creek bank. He saw nothing. No movement, no glint of metal, only the vast, indifferent landscape and the oppressive sense of eyes upon him. Martha's gaze, he knew, was fixed on the ridge from the kitchen window. He reached the creek bank, sliding down the short, eroded slope into the cool shade of the cottonwoods. The water gurgled over smooth stones, a sound usually soothing, now feeling exposed. He scanned the opposite bank, the trees upstream and down. Nothing. The pump housing stood a few yards away, its iron handle gleaming dully. He approached cautiously, Winchester ready. The pump handle felt cold. He gripped it, preparing to prime it, to draw the cool water up from the aquifer below. He pushed down. Nothing. The handle moved with sickening, unnatural ease. No resistance. No familiar sucking sound. Just the scrape of dry metal on dry metal. Dread coiled in his stomach. He knelt beside the pump base, ignoring the mud soaking into his knees. The connecting rod was visible, or rather it wasn't. Where the thick iron rod should connect the handle to the pump mechanism deep in the well casing, there was only a ragged, freshly cut end. Someone had sawed through it. Cleanly. Recently. Sabotage. Corbin's parting shot about water hadn't been idle chatter. It was a declaration. They'd been here, at the heart of the ranch's survival, while Silas was facing Corbin in the yard or locked in the house with Martha. They'd crippled his water supply without firing a shot. A slow, cruel strangulation. Silas stared at the severed rod, the cold fury returning, sharper now, edged with a desperate chill. No water for the horses. No water for the small milk cow penned near the barn. Little left in the house pitcher. Gage wasn't just claiming him. He was methodically dismantling his ability to exist on this land, starving him out, forcing him to choose, surrender Martha or watch everything he'd built, everything he had left, wither and die. The gurgle of the creek, once life-giving, now sounded like mocking laughter. He looked up, scanning the ridge line again, the endless sagebrush. Where were they? Watching him discover their handiwork, enjoying his helplessness? A sound cut through the heavy stillness. Not from the ridge, from upstream. A sharp crack, like a dry branch breaking underfoot. Then another, and another. Rhythmic, purposeful. Silas flattened himself against the pump housing, raising the Winchester, his heart hammering. He peered upstream, towards the bend in the creek where the cottonwoods grew thicker. The sound wasn't footsteps. It was chopping. He edged along the bank, keeping low, using the tall reeds and creek side brush for cover. The chopping sound grew louder, clearer. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The rhythm of an axe biting into wood. He rounded the bend, staying hidden in the dense foliage, and froze. 50 yards upstream, standing knee-deep in the creek itself, was a figure. A man. He wore rough, homespun trousers rolled up, his back to Silas. He was swinging a heavy axe with powerful, practiced strokes, not at a tree, but the thick wooden trunk of the box tees flume. The ancient, weathered structure that diverted a portion of the creek flow towards Silas's irrigation ditch for the small kitchen garden near the house. Thwack! Another chunk of wood flew into the rushing water. The man paused, wiped sweat from his brow with his forearm, then resumed his systematic destruction. He wasn't one of Corbin's riders Silas had seen on the ridge. This man was broader, older, with thick gray-streaked hair tied back. He worked with the calm efficiency of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary chore. Silas recognized him. Eli Burrows, a taciturn homesteader who ran a few scraggly sheep on a patch of poor land further up the creek near the foothills. A neighbor, of sorts, though they rarely exchanged more than a nod when their paths crossed miles apart on the open range. What was Eli doing? Why sabotage the flume? It only fed Silas's garden. It didn't affect Eli's meager water access upstream. Unless, had Gage reached Eli too? Bought him? Threatened him? Silas stepped out from the reeds, the Winchester held low but ready. Eli. His voice cut through the rhythmic chopping, sharp as the axe blows. Eli Burrows froze mid-swing. He turned slowly, his face weathered as old saddle leather, his eyes narrowing against the sun. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He lowered the axe, letting the head rest in the creek bed, water swirling around it. Silas, Eli acknowledged, his voice gravelly. He didn't offer an explanation. He just stood there, water swirling around his legs, the ruined flume timber gaping behind him like a broken bone. His gaze drifted past Silas, towards the distant ridge where Corbin's men were camped. The message was clear. The pressure had arrived, and Eli Burrows, like Silas's water pump, had broken. The gurgle of the creek mocked Silas Thorne. Eli Burrows stood knee-deep in the current, the ruined flume timber gaping behind him like a wound, the heavy axe hanging limp in his grip. His weathered face, turned towards Silas, held no malice, only a deep, weary resignation. His gaze flickered past Silas, towards the distant ridge where Elias Corbin's men watched. The message was clear, written in the language of fear. Harlan Gage's reach extended beyond hired guns. It strangled the life out of neighbors too afraid to say no. Eli, Silas repeated, his voice low but carrying over the rush of water. He kept the Winchester angled down, not threatening, but present, a symbol of a line drawn. What's this about? Eli shifted, the water swirling around his legs. He looked down at the axe head submerged in the creek bed, then back at Silas, his eyes shadowed. They told me it was just the flume. Said you wouldn't need it no more. Soon. His voice was a dry rasp, like boots on gravel. Said if I didn't, they'd see my sheep scattered to the wolves. My cabin burned. He swallowed, a hard lump moving in his throat. They got a jet cart or two, Silas, before me. Word is, he won't be coming back this way. Not ever. Eli's gaze held a terrible apology. They're cutting you off. From everything. The confirmation was a physical blow. Sabotaged pump. Sabotaged flume. Supplies cut. Gage wasn't just threatening violence. He was orchestrating a slow, meticulous strangulation. Silas pictured Martha in the besieged house, the pitcher of water dwindling, the terror a constant companion. He thought of Clara, her final, fading breaths, the helplessness that had haunted him. That helplessness had no place here, not now. He wouldn't watch another life crushed under the heel of a bully, even one as powerful as Gage. They cut the pump rod too, Silas stated flatly. The fury was there, cold and hard beneath the surface, but it was tempered now by a grim clarity. Rage would get Martha killed. He needed strategy. He needed Martha. Eli flinched. Didn't know that. Just the flume. He looked genuinely sickened. They got men watching the creek, Silas. Upstream and down. Saw him when I came. Hid till they passed. He gestured vaguely with the axe handle. Said if I warned you, same as the sheep. Silas scanned the banks, the dense cottonwoods upstream, the sagebrush flats downstream. Nothing moved but the wind-tossed leaves and the dancing light on the water. But Eli was right. The silence felt deliberate, watchful. Corbin's men were there, ensuring the isolation was complete, waiting for thirst and fear to do their work. "You finished here, Eli?" Silas asked, his voice devoid of judgment. He understood fear. He'd lived with its ghost for 3 years. Eli looked at the ruined flume, then dropped the axe into the creek with a splash. It sank into the silt. "Finished," he mumbled. He waded towards the bank, water sluicing off his rough trousers. He climbed out, avoiding Silas's eyes. "I'm sorry, Silas. Truly." "Ride home, Eli," Silas said, his tone weary. "Bar your door. Tend your sheep." There was no fight to be had here, not with a broken neighbor. The real enemy watched from the shadows. Eli nodded, shamefaced, and trudged off upstream, disappearing into the brush without a backward glance. Silas stood alone by the ruined flume. The severed pump wrought a cold weight in his memory. The sun beat down relentless. The wind river peaks shimmered in the haze, indifferent sentinels. Water. They had no water. He moved back towards the house, not with stealth this time, but with a deliberate pace, the Winchester held ready. He scanned the ridge, the barn, the corral. The 2 horses stood listless in the heat, their coats dull. The milk cow lowed plaintively from her small pen. The silence pressed in, heavier than before, charged with the knowledge of the unseen cordon tightening around the box T. Martha flung the door open as he approached the porch. Her face was pale, etched with lines of fear and sleeplessness, but her eyes held a fierce, burning question. "Eli? What was he?" She saw the answer in Silas's grim expression, the empty water bucket still hanging from his hand. "Flume's gone. Pump's cut." Eli was persuaded. Silas stepped inside, the relative cool of the kitchen a small relief. He barred the door. "Jed's gone too. Run off or worse. Gage has cut us off, Martha." Completely. The color drained from her face. She swayed slightly, bracing herself against the table where the carved G button still lay, a malevolent talisman. Her gaze went to the nearly empty water pitcher. The reality of their situation, trapped, parched, surrounded, crashed over her. The hunted terror threatened to resurface, to drown the defiance Silas had glimpsed. Then it's over," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They win. You have to let me go, Silas." Her eyes darted towards the window, towards the cottonwood. "Before they make you watch." Silas crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a wall, an anchor. "Look at me, Martha." His voice was low, intense, commanding her attention. She lifted her gaze, tears welling. "Gage wins if we let fear choose. He wins if we believe we're beaten before the fight's even done." He pointed towards the button. "He sends snakes like Corbin. He breaks neighbors like Eli. He hides behind money and threats. But he ain't here. They are." He gestured towards the ridge. 3 men, watching us, waiting for us to crack. He leaned closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "You ran because you're strong, Martha. You ran because you wouldn't break. Don't break now. Not here. Help me fight." The plea, the shared defiance, struck a chord. A tremor ran through her, but the terror receded, replaced by a slow-burning ember of that fierce will. She took a shaky breath. "How?" "They have the water, the high ground, the numbers." Silas looked around the kitchen, his mind racing against the ticking clock of their thirst. His gaze fell on the cast-iron stove, the wood box beside it, the kerosene lantern on the shelf. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form. It hinged on Corbin's arrogance, on Gage's belief in slow suffocation. It hinged on the vastness of the Wyoming night. "They're watching the creek," Silas said slowly, thinking aloud. "Watching the house, waiting for us to get desperate enough to make a run for water or for me to bring you out." He picked up the G button, its cold weight a reminder of the enemy's touch. "They think they have time. They think thirst will do their work. He looked at Martha, a spark of grim determination in his eyes. "We give him a show. We make him think they're right. But tonight we turn their game against him." The Wyoming night descended, velvet black and immense, pricked by icy stars. The wind, a constant companion, sighed across the sagebrush flats, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, dry rustle of unseen creatures. In the Box T Ranch house, a single lantern burned low in the kitchen window, a feeble eye in the darkness. Silas and Martha moved like ghosts in the gloom. They'd rationed the last of the water, a few swallows each, barely enough to wet their parched throats. The horses and cow would have to endure. Their lowing had ceased, replaced by a weary silence. Silas had spent the fading light meticulously preparing. He dragged an old, empty water barrel from the barn, positioning it near the back door. He'd gathered rags, a small can of coal oil used for the lanterns, and the last precious slivers of soap. Now, under the cover of darkness, they worked. Martha, her hands trembling only slightly now, shredded the rags into long strips. Silas carefully soaked them in the coal oil, the pungent smell sharp in the still air. He packed these oily rags, interspersed with slivers of soap that would create thick, choking smoke, into the empty barrel. He fashioned a crude fuse from a dry strip of cloth soaked at one end. It was a desperate signal fire, a beacon of false distress. "Light it just before midnight," Silas instructed Martha, his voice a whisper barely audible over the wind. From the kitchen window, toss a burning stick into the barrel. Then get low, stay away from the windows. The smoke should be thick, White. Looks like the house is burning from the inside out. Martha nodded, her face pale but resolute in the lantern's weak glow. The shared plan, the act of defiance, had steeled her. "And you?" "I'll be at the creek," Silas said, checking the load in his Colt and slinging the Winchester over his shoulder. He'd filled his canteen with the last of their drinking water. When they see the smoke, they'll think we're panicking, maybe trying to flee the fire, heading for the creek. Corbin will send at least one man down to intercept, maybe two. They'll leave the ridge. He met her eyes. "That's when I move. I get to the spring seat behind the big rocks upstream. It's small, but it's clean. It's not the main creek. They won't be watching it." He paused, the weight of the gamble heavy. "You hold the fort here. If anyone approaches the house before dawn, you know what to do." He nodded towards a shotgun leaning against the wall near the door, Martha's chosen weapon. She followed his gaze, then looked back at him. In the dim light, the fear was still present, but it was overshadowed now by a fierce protectiveness, not just for herself, but for him, for this fragile stand they were making. "Come back, Silas," she whispered, the words thick with unspoken emotion. "Just come back." He held her gaze for a long moment. The connection forged in shared terror and quiet defiance was a tangible thing in the charged darkness. He thought of Clara, not with paralyzing grief, but with a surge of fierce love that demanded he protect the life before him now. He wouldn't fail. Not again. "I will," he promised, his voice rough. He slipped out the back door like a shadow, swallowed instantly by the inky blackness. The wind tugged at his coat. He moved not towards the creek, but parallel to it, using the gully carved by a long dry runoff, keeping low, senses straining. He heard only the wind and the distant cry of coyote. He reached the cluster of large, lichen-covered boulders half a mile upstream, near the base of a low rise. Hidden within them was the small, clear seep he'd found years ago while tracking a stray calf. He filled his canteen, the cold, clean water a benediction. He drank sparingly, then settled into the deepest crevice between the rocks to wait. The Winchester lay across his knees, the cold metal a familiar comfort. He watched the ridge, a darker line against the starry sky. The minutes crawled by, each one an eternity measured in the pounding of his heart and the dry rasp in his throat. The vastness of the night pressed down. He thought of Martha alone in the house, watching the clock, gathering her courage to light the signal. He thought of Corbin's flinty eyes, Gage's unseen menace. He thought of Eli Burrows' shame, Jed Carter's fate. This was bigger than Martha now. It was about the rot Gage spread, the fear that poisoned the land itself. Then, just as the moon began its descent towards the western peaks, he saw it. A bloom of light near the ranch house. Orange at first, then surging upwards, thick and white, billowing into the night sky. Martha's signal. The false fire. Silas held his breath, scanning the ridge. For agonizing seconds, nothing. Had they seen it? Had they fallen for it? Then movement. Two dark shapes detached themselves from the ridgeline, silhouetted briefly against the stars before plunging down the slope, heading not directly for the house, but angling towards the creek bend downstream, the obvious place to cut off fleeing survivors. Corbin, or one of his men, had taken the bait. Only one silhouette remained on the ridge. The watcher. Silas moved. He flowed out of the rocks like water, keeping the rise between him and the ridge, running low and fast towards the spot where the watcher would be silhouetted against the skyline. He covered the ground quickly, fueled by adrenaline and desperate hope. He reached the base of the ridge, the sagebrush scratching at his legs. He started the climb, moving from rock to rock, using every scrap of cover, his breath coming in short, silent gasps. The Winchester was a hindrance now. He slung it securely across his back and drew the Colt, its walnut grip slick in his palm. He crested the ridge, not at the peak, but 20 yards west of where the lone watcher stood, a dark shape against the horizon, his attention fixed on the billowing white smoke near the house and the two riders converging on the creek bend below. Silas approached from behind, silent as the night wind. 10 yards. 5. He could smell the man now, leather, tobacco, horse sweat. The watcher stiffened. A sixth sense? He started to turn. "Don't," Silas said, his voice low and hard as granite. The Colt's muzzle pressed firmly into the man's back, just below the shoulder blade. The man froze. He didn't reach for his own holstered revolver. He slowly raised his hands, palms out. "Thorne," he breathed, recognition in the tense whisper. "Where's Corbin?" Silas demanded, keeping the pressure steady. Down at the creek. With Dobbs. Waiting for you." The man's voice trembled slightly. "Engage?" He said more. The man hesitated. Silas nudged him sharply with the Colt barrel. "Talk." "Don't know. Honest." Corbin reports. "We just do what he says." Gage is back in Red River. Waits for results. The man swallowed audibly. He figured you'd break easy. Or the woman would. Silas's grip tightened on the Colt. Gage, safe in his den of power, pulling strings, crushing lives from a distance. The injustice burned. He looked down towards the ranch. The white smoke still billowed, a ghostly pillar in the moonlight. Martha was holding on. He had water. He had a prisoner. But it wasn't enough. Corbin and Dobbs were still down there, waiting. They'd return to the ridge. They'd find their man missing. The siege would tighten. He needed more than water. He needed an end. He needed Gage exposed. An idea, audacious and dangerous, sparked. It relied on the prisoner's fear, on Corbin's arrogance, and on the one thing Gage valued above all else, his untouchable reputation. "You want to walk away from this?" Silas asked the man, his voice dangerously calm. The man tensed. What you mean?" "I mean Gage loses face if his men fail. He loses face if his dirty laundry gets aired. You ride back to Red River. Tonight. You ride straight to the telegraph office. You send a message." Silas leaned closer, his words a cold whisper in the man's ear. He told him exactly what to say. And to whom? The name of a newspaper editor in Cheyenne known for digging, a federal marshal station 2 territories over. The message was simple. Harlan Gage's hired guns caught attempting murder by starvation on the Box T Ranch. Evidence of coercion, sabotage. Witnesses naming names. Silas Thorne holding proof. You send that, Silas finished, and you vanish. Far away. or Gage will bury you alongside whatever story he tries to spin. The man was silent for a long moment, weighing the terrifying options. Face Silas Thorne's justice now, or face Harlan Gage's wrath later. Proof, he finally rasped. What proof? Silas pulled the carved G button from his pocket, pressing it into the man's raised hand. This, Corbin dropped in my barn. Gage's mark. Tell him Silas Thorne has more. Tell him to come look. It was a bluff, but a potent one. The button, the sabotage, the coerced neighbors. It was a story waiting to be told. Gage's power relied on shadows. Silas would drag him into the light. The man closed his fist around the button, his knuckles white. He understood. Exposure was Gage's real weakness. All right, he breathed. All right, I'll do it. Silas lowered the colt, stepping back. Your horse is down the slope. Go. Now. Ride hard. And pray the story breaks before Gage breaks you. The man didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the ridge towards the scrub where the horses were picketed, moving with desperate speed. Silas watched him go, then melted back into the shadows on the ridge, watching the creek bend. He saw the flicker of a match below as Corbin or Dobbs lit a cigarette. They were still waiting, oblivious. Waiting for a desperate rancher and his cook who wouldn't come. Waiting for a victory that was already slipping through Gage's fingers. Silas turned his gaze east, towards the distant, invisible sprawl of Red River. The first faint hint of gray was lightening the horizon. Dawn was coming, and with it, Silas hoped, the reckoning Harlan Gage never saw coming. He had water, he had a fighting chance, and he had Martha Croft, who had lit a fire that was more than just smoke and rags. She lit the spark of defiance that might just burn Gage's empire down. He settled in to wait for the sun and a long ride home to the woman holding the fort. The battle wasn't over, but the tide, against all odds, had turned. Epilogue. 3 months later. The Wyoming spring air was crisp, smelling of damp earth, and sagebrush finally freed from winter's grip. Wildflowers, tiny blue lupin and bright yellow balsam root, dotted the silver-green plains. The creek, swollen with snow melt from the wind rivers, gurgled energetically past the box T, its sound a constant, life-affirming murmur. Silas Thorne leaned against the newly repaired porch rail, a tin mug of coffee warming his hands. He watched Martha Croft. No, Martha Smith now, a name chosen for a fresh start, carefully transplanting seedlings into the rich soil of the resurrected kitchen garden. The flume, rebuilt with stout new timber, trickled a steady stream into the irrigation ditch. The pump handle, sporting a gleaming new connecting rod, yielded cold, clear water with every stroke. The town of Red River, a week's ride southeast, still buzzed. The shockwaves from Silas Thorne's stand had rippled far beyond the sagebrush flats. The prisoner had ridden hard, sent the telegrams. The Cheyenne newspaper editor, a dogged man with a grudge against powerful bullies, had arrived with a photographer and a federal marshal in tow just as Corbin, frustrated and suspicious after the false fire and the disappearance of his man, made a final, clumsy attempt to storm the ranch house at dawn. The confrontation was brief, chaotic. Corbin, seeing the law and the press, tried to bluff. Dobbs panicked, drew his gun. A shot rang out, wild, hitting only porchwood, and the marshal subdued Dobbs. Corbin, cornered, his arrogance crumbling, spilled his guts under the marshal's cold gaze and the reporter's eager pencil, implicating Harlan Gage in a litany of crimes. Coercion, sabotage, intimidation, even Jed Carter's disappearance. His body was found later in a ravine. Gage, confronted in his Red River office by the marshal and the damning evidence printed in the Cheyenne paper, tried bluster, then threats. But the shadows he'd ruled were gone. The fear was broken. He was arrested, his empire crumbling faster than a sandcastle in the tide. The town was indeed shocked by the depth of Gage's corruption, shocked by the quiet rancher who'd brought him down not with a blazing gunfight, but with a desperate bluff, a carved button, and a telegraph wire. Silas took a sip of coffee. Martha straightened up, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of earth. She saw him watching and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, banishing the last ghosts of hunted fear. The bruises were long faded. The flinch was gone. She walked towards the porch, the scent of turned earth and growing things clinging to her. "Peas are in," she announced, her voice strong and clear. "Should do well with this, son." Silas nodded, offering her his mug. She took it, her fingers brushing his. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the creek's song, the distant call of the meadowlark, and the quiet hum of the ranch slowly healing. The graves under the cottonwood were tended, wildflowers blooming at their bases. The loneliness that had haunted Silas for 3 years hadn't vanished, but it had changed, softened by a shared resilience, a hard-won peace. He hadn't just protected Martha. He'd found a partner in rebuilding the life Gage had tried to choke. The shocking thing wasn't the violence. It was the quiet victory, the simple act of planting peas where only fear had grown before. The whole town talked of the rancher's defiance, but here, on the wind-swept plains of the Box T, the true wonder was the quiet sound of roots taking hold.